Sephora dominates the beauty space in a way like no one has before. But, according to books and online sources, its true origin is in fact a mystery. Most mention Sephora began in 1969 or 1970, however, that's only partially true. In fact, the origin of Sephora is far more complicated than that. So where did it come from, and why is it such a mystery? By most accounts, in 1969, Sephora, the company, already existed under a different name that is currently unknown or unconfirmed, with, according to later tax filings, only one store on Rue de Passy that opened in 1970, though it also opened and was running under a different name, unknown at this time in the video. However, in contrast to the other sources, this book, The Sephora Story, claims it was a chain of stores at this time, which directly contradicts the later tax filings that say it was just the one store. Because of this, it's unclear how big the company was at this point, with the biggest mystery being, what was Sephora called before this? To find this out, I started as close to the beginning as I could. We know that the company that would go on to be Sephora had been purchased by Boots in 1970. Boots, here pictured in 1974, at the time were a very famous pharmacy chain in England that was expanding throughout the world. But Boots wasn't a public company until 1982, and unfortunately as a result, not once in their annual reports is Sephora mentioned around the time it was purchased and renamed by Boots. The earliest clue, in fact, was from their principal companies list in 1979 that includes, for the first time, a cosmetics and toiletries retailing company that was only 70% owned by Boots, named Beauté, Hygiène et Soins, that was registered in France. Thanks to some later legal filings where they registered for the name Sephora in the US in 1988, we can confirm that Beauté, Hygiène et Soins SA was the parent company of Sephora, though the name they were trading under before, and potentially if they themselves had a parent company, was still a mystery. At least that was until I contacted a friend of mine in Paris who found this website that claimed it was part of a chain named Nouveau Gallery before it was bought by Boots. With this nugget, I went down a real rabbit hole and actually discovered what I think was the true origin of the shop that would become Sephora. Founded in 1897, Nouveau Gallery grew to be an incredibly large chain of stores in France, including things like supermarkets and department stores on top of the cosmetic stores that they obviously owned. Over time, this group grew and grew through mergers and acquisitions, and at one point acquired the store on Rue de Passy. It's never mentioned specifically in media or public tax documents that I could find, so it's safe to say that it was just another one of their many Nouveau Gallery stores that existed in France. They were a colossal company, often compared to Le Galeries Lafayette, but by the late 60s, 1967 to be exact, Nouveau Galleries were seeing some hard times with the French stock market crashing enough to cause ripples, with this article even stating that there had been a rise in takeover bids as a result. However, they still had 1.97 billion in francs in turnover, so this hard times is very relative. Still, they combated this by opening stores in New York, they opened a massive shopping center in Nice, and they took a stake in the BHV. So, by 1969, they had a turnover of 2.5 billion francs. But this period of growth wasn't to last. Starting in 1969, their nationwide workers' strike became a big news story, with hundreds upon hundreds walking out and going on hunger strike in protest of extending opening hours without employees getting things like full employment, a holiday bonus, or even regular wages. These strikes went on until 1970, but it was only about to get worse. You see, on top of the strikes, there was a man who, while going through a psychotic break, had become infatuated with a lady working at a Nouveau Gallery store. On October 4th, 1972, he opened fire, killing 4 people, including 1 little girl, and injuring 6 others. It also was really big news in France at the time, with eventually the state being blamed for negligence and the killer jailed for homicide. These sorts of things would have obviously affected public perception, and the company as a whole started to get into financial trouble. This really helps to explain why they would begin selling off just little parts of their business, like the 70% sold to Boots in 1970, but they kept the stores open under the Nouveau Gallery name. At least that was until 1972, when we know it closed pending a reopening as Sephora in 1973. In fact, as a whole, Nouveau Gallery wouldn't last much longer after this at all. By 1978, the company was losing 20 and 30% on previously profitable areas, and they were forced to lose 50 staff, which, in case you're reading this, it's bad Google Translate. Here is the French. They are losing 50 staff here. By 1986, this heavily affected cash flow, and despite their best efforts, they shut their doors in 1992 after these decades of problems. Ultimately, it would prove to have been a smart choice for Boots to change the name to Sephora all the way back in 1973, as it helped break away from the established but now fading Nouveau Gallery name to conceive the new brand of Sephora in the first place. Though there is also the secondary reasoning that Boots just wanted their own cosmetic retailer in France as part of their ongoing global expansion plans that we did discuss earlier in the video, and they needed a new name to do so, evidenced by the fact that they would go on to own 100% of the company in 1981, which of course was bang in the middle of all these issues that Nouveau Gallery were having. In complete contrast to their previous owner though, after it officially opened as Sephora in 1973, they would switch focus onto providing evolutions in retail after the introduction of a self-service model, i.e. having products on shelves that would allow customers to pick up the products for themselves that would be a real differentiator in the market to distance themselves from the very established Nouveau Gallery name. This doesn't really sound like much today, but just the ability to self-serve cosmetic products without the need of an assistant was seriously novel at this time, as actually the concept of self-service shopping entirely didn't exist in Europe until the late 40s, early 50s, depending on the country. It was first implemented in supermarkets, but they hadn't really rolled out to other areas of retail yet, though the concept was already implemented in up-and-coming cosmetic stores in France, but we will get onto that in a second. So just taking that concept and applying it to a very large cosmetics retail outlet in Paris was very enticing to get the customers back in the door. In fact, moving on over then to Boots' annual reports, by 1979 it was sufficiently successful that on top of the Rue de Passy store, they opened 2 more, though they don't actually technically mention Sephora by name quite yet. That wouldn't appear on their filings until 1982, so covering the year 1981, with this quote saying that they were, quote, trading as Sephora, which means the shop was named Sephora, but the company was named something else, which of course was Beauty Je ne Sois. But even Beauty Je ne Sois doesn't appear on the tax filings until 1977, so for the year 1976, fully 6 years after it was purchased. Throughout this time, Sephora was extremely small. In fact, it took 8 years for them to see growth with Sephora, but it did boom a little bit from there, with their annual report stating that in 1981, sales were finally up 54% and they opened 2 more stores to make a total of 5. They had 10% growth in 1982, leading to 3 more stores being planned. By 1984, sales were up another 59%, more than doubling their competitors as they expanded to 13 stores. Then, by 1985, their sales at Sephora were up 78%, and by 1987 it had expanded to 38 stores, which is exactly the amount of stores that we know Sephora had before its next step. Interestingly though, Boots at this point seems to think that this was the limitation of Sephora and were looking at consolidating to increase profits, clearly having no idea of the monolith it was about to become. In fact, they wouldn't do much with the brand again for a very long time. As a whole, Europe only accounted for 5.8% of their turnover and 4.2% of their profit anyway, so it seems it was just kind of forgotten. Actually, it wasn't until 1993, another 6 years later, that it would be even mentioned again by more than a sentence after sales were up 17.1% to 69.1 million, that only saw a 200,000 British pound profit, hence why they probably didn't mention it, because this is just a drop in the Boots' ocean. However, this is the last time Sephora or Beauty Je ne Sois was ever mentioned on Boots filings, as the company, as part of a larger consolidation effort, was sold. Sephora, still not in its final form, was purchased in 1993 by Dominique Mansard, who purchased the Sephora brand, complete with its 38 stores, for $61 million. Under Mansard, Sephora would change unrecognizably as it was merged with Mansard's existing store, Shop 8, which interestingly, many people consider to be the true origin of Sephora. You see, originally, Mansard founded a perfumery under a different name in Limoges, France in 1969. Here, taking inspiration from Estée Lauder, he began the first store to allow customers to try on cosmetics before purchasing, which, for the first time, allowed the consumer the right to their own opinion over what they thought looked good on them before they purchased, subsequently having them spend more time in store to find products that they decided that they enjoyed. The more time they spend in store, usually the more money they spend, so it's a phenomenal idea. But it wasn't until 1979, when he reformatted the entire store and changed its name to Shop 8, that the store would become a revolution in retail. He made two changes. The first was to allow customers to browse the products by themselves, test the products by themselves without the need of an assistant, i.e. he had the products and testers on the shelves instead of behind a counter. And the second was to merchandise by product category instead of by brand. So customers were encouraged to compare like products from different brands in a way that redeveloped cosmetic merchandising to encourage customer satisfaction because they felt like they had found the most bang for their buck. This is obviously considered standard practice today, but it was completely revolutionary in a time when most stores followed the standard of having a brand-specific sales assistant, like a pharmacist, guide you through products and suggest something for you in a way that was much more of a hard sell than just picking up the products and being able to compare them for yourself. So, by changing these two things, it put the power in the hands of the cosmetics consumer really for the first time, and eventually would completely change the way that we shop cosmetics. But they still weren't Sephora yet, as there still was one very important factor that hadn't been introduced to Shop 8. At this point, they were seen as a lower-end or mid-market brand just because of how much it resembled a supermarket. And so, this self-service retail format just wasn't necessarily something that caught on especially quickly. Actually, from 1979 until 1984, they'd only acquired 3 more stores, though that's mostly because, unlike Boots, he needed financial backers in order to grow the company. This would come through selling a majority share of the company to a larger group named Promode, who were supposed to help fund his expansion. According to this book, there is little known about this time, but it seems as if Promode didn't put in the effort to grow Shop 8 in the way that it really needed, as they seemed to treat this relationship more like a loan than a business partnership that they owned the majority stake in. You see, Mansard had borrowed money to expand to a total of 12 stores, with the last being erected in 1990, but when looking to expand further, this time into Paris, the center of the cosmetic world, they denied him the money, citing his previous debt had not been paid off yet, which, by the way, would be normal. Few stores turn a profit in their first or even second year, let alone having to pay off the cost of 12 stores. So Mansard now felt stunted. But, not allowing this to deter him, he set his sights on buying back the shares to his own company. To do this, he sought financing from Apax Partners, who are registered on their official documents as Amboise, which is their parent company, and private equity group Astorg, who not only agreed to help him buy back Shop 8, but funded his desired expansion into Paris as well. The several stores that he owned under the Shop 8 name, which were all registered separately, all would be taken under a new parent company named Mansard l'Univers Beauté, and together with his backers, they set their sights on expansion. Initially, they planned to just erect their own stores, but due to the 1991 recession continuing on, they were able to take advantage of this situation and buy out a company we know had not been doing financially as well as their massive parent company had expected, Sephora. In 1993, Sephora, despite how neglected it was by Boots because it really was only breaking even, was the largest perfume retailer in France, and so the name carried heft. For this reason, Sephora was the name to live on, and all Shop 8 branded stores became named Sephora, and all Sephora branded stores were totally reformatted with half the Shop 8 format, and another half of the format would come from a different source but would finally make Sephora, Sephora. In a totally different business that was named Mille et un Parfums, which he opened in very early 1993, he began testing out the combination of his three concepts, so testers, brand-based merchandising, and self-service, in a luxury positioning with the inclusion of very expensive, backlit, black and white, luxurious fittings. Pretty instantly, Mansard realized this was a firecracker positioning and embedded it into Sephora, merging the three concepts together in the luxury space for the first time in retail history. It was a sensation in France, and over the next 3 years expanded to 54 stores and controlled 8% of the entire French perfume market. However, Mansard and partners had in fact stipulated way back when they made their contract that they were to disband in this year 1997. Despite how big the company had become under their parent company, it was always their plan to sell the company at this point to allow Mansard to retire before his 50th birthday. Of course, though, when a company is this well set up, it's a very easy sell, especially to a then quickly expanding LVMH, who purchased 100% of Sephora for $262 million in a purchase meant to help them control the distribution for their already owned luxury brands more closely. They invested very heavily into Sephora very quickly, buying out their biggest competitor, Marie-Jean Godard, who had more stores than Sephora but just didn't sell as much in volume in 1998. They subsequently turned all 75 Marie-Jean Godard stores into Sephora, meaning they now stood at a whopping 129 stores across France, controlling now 18% of the French perfume market and increasing sales to 2 billion francs. They also opened their online store in 1998, well before their competitors. The first US Sephora store in New York in 1998, which was closely followed by 39 others erected across the US in the same year. They opened 53 more stores across Europe to a total of 182 European stores. In the same year, they bought out a number of smaller chains, then continued this in 1999 by buying the 46-store Laguna chain and the 19-chain-strong Boydie in 2000 to bring them to 460 worldwide stores. And by 2002, they had plans for a further 175 US stores on top of that. Though it wasn't always smooth sailing into new countries, failing in all of Japan, Spain, and the UK, by the end of 2004, they had amassed a total of 521 stores worldwide, with 460 new stores opening the following year. They had several hit products after they made their own affordable line and were seeing double-digit sales growth in the US year on year. By 2006, Sephora was unstoppable, but yet it still was not the ubiquitous store that the US knows it as today. Actually, that wouldn't come until they penned a very unexpected partnership with a flailing JCPenney. JCPenney at this time was not a popular store. It had an aging demographic and was failing to capture a younger, more spend-driven clientele. So it was quite the strange choice for Sephora, who are an upscale cosmetics company, to go into a down-market collaboration with JCPenney. And yet, they were again about to redefine the cosmetics retailing world. Under their agreement, Sephora would have in-store shops decked out with the famed black and white backlit displays, complete with dedicated staff in 60 of the then over 1,000 JCPenney stores. Each of their store-within-a-stores would be in a visible and prominent location at the center of the department store in the most advantageous locations to implement this strategy, meaning that Sephora would get prime real estate locations and JCPenney would entice a much-needed younger demographic. In short, it was a win-win. It was a wild success and saw that they were perfectly poised to take advantage of the rise in beauty YouTube that came as a result of the 2008 recession, which subsequently saw the demand for more global Sephora stores skyrocket, hence why we had this store in London's Mayfair open. By this, I of course mean that in times of recession it's often found that people tighten their belts. However, when customers cannot spend money on a new garment, they could still easily buy a lipstick or a foundation that was at a much lower price point and was now being sold to them through their favorite YouTubers. Makeup became both desirable and affordable, quickly influencing a trend to have copious amounts of makeup stored perfectly in boxes in a beauty room that was extremely desirable at the time, and really continued them on this path of having an omni-channel strategy, which is a fancy way of saying that there's cohesion between, in this example, an on- and offline customer experience. This, in a way, mimicked the ethos that Mansard brought to the brand, in that customers can interact with the product without needing assistance. So it seemed like a very genuine expansion of their customer reach, as seen here on the adaptation of the Cannes retailing success matrix, as mentioned in this book, The Shopping Revolution. But their influence didn't just end there. A major part of why Sephora really thrived in this time was their point system that saw customers rewarded pretty heavily for spending in store. It became a flex to accumulate a large amount of points on your account, and their program, which categorized customers into groups depending on how much they spent, provided incentives for young customers to spend increasingly higher and higher amounts of money in order to get to the next tier. Furthermore, they started at this point investing in the future with LVMH's Kendo in 2014 that would foster new brands like Fenty Beauty, who I have a video on, that could then be sold in Sephora, meaning their product range kept desirable, fresh, and unique in comparison to their competitors, all while keeping all of the brands in-house. By 2016, Sephora represented 45% of all of LVMH's business, according to this book that also states that they're seeing double-digit growth. But by 2019, they actually started to go through a little bit more of a public rough patch than they'd been through before. Over the years, they had had a few lawsuits in regards to discrimination, which seemingly they hadn't taken seriously enough, with the most famous example in 2019 of Scissor speaking out against being racially profiled, which Sephora responded to by shutting all the stores for the day of discrimination training, though it was later revealed that the day was already planned and that they simply just didn't do much about the incident at all. Then in 2020, they split with JCPenney to go into partnership with their competitor Kohl's in a very messy breakup that saw them sue each other. Then in 2022, they were exposed for selling customer data that they accumulated from the points program, which is actually often the case for these points program. That's why they're so common and so profitable. Sephora was charged $1.2 million for this, though that's really just a drop in the bucket, as they, in the same year, contributed to LVMH's 660 million euros in perfumes and cosmetics after they had record sales and profits. So yeah, this was a bit more of a public rough patch, but it didn't really seem to affect them whatsoever. Really, at this point, Sephora just seems like it cannot fail. It's become too big, too successful, and they have the financial backing to allow for a supposed endless growth, although that's really a fallacy. All companies do eventually fall, but Sephora has made such incredible strides in the industry, from their mysteriously unknown beginning to being purchased twice to bigger and bigger heights, implementing things like sampling, self-service, and online stores, and even more omni-channel structures involving their app, that there simply wasn't enough time to talk about. Sephora won't be going anywhere anytime soon, and if in many years into the future it does fall, it will be very sorely missed. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, but about fashion, please check out my fashion channel. And for early access, please visit my Patreon.